So, a couple of days ago, we saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Quentin Tarantino's new movie.
Yeah. Wait, should we introduce ourselves?
Yeah, I suppose we can. I was just trying to. I was trying for the hook, the natural, hook at the beginning, where you it's like an action.
I mean, it'll probably
statement.
be like in the title.
Okay,
right?
okay,
So
fine. We can introduce
we
ourselves.
can just keep rolling. Okay. So, I'm Cory Cogley, and this is Isaac Handelman, and
I'm Isaac Handelman.
Yeah, that's Isaac Handelman's voice. We are doing a podcast. This is our first episode, sort of.
Yeah, we had a test pilot episode.
Besides test pilot episode, which will be a bonus for our loyal subscribers.
Yes.
So anyway, Isaac, why don't you start us off by telling us what we saw this week?
We saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the new Quentin Tarantino movie that stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt and Margot Robbie and takes place in the late 1960s in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
No surprise there. And it was marketed as a story that ties in numerous historical figures and is set against the backdrop of the fading, free-spirited 1960s in the shadow of the Manson murders and the cultural upheaval that whole horrific incident marks in a lot of history texts.
Yeah, the choice of 1969 as the date and leading into 1970 is very clear, not only in the events of the film, but also that turning point in Hollywood history, the optimism of all the Hollywood up-and-comers that kind of shifted once everybody found out about the Manson murders, the kind of horrible stuff that was going on, and that moved people away from the hippie, free-spirited, and more into the 70s.
Yeah, and so we had, this is around the time that the new Hollywood movement was spawned and replaced the big budget studio productions that dominated through the 50s. And so we have a period of immense upheaval and transition that's being documented here. The trailers might have you believe, and to an extent it's true that a lot of that historical context is present. And in fact, a lot of the characters in the film are real historical figures, which is something we'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. But I think it's safe to say that this is not a documentarian approach to late 1960s Hollywood.
Definitely not.
Filmmaking.
The sense that I got was it seemed more documentarian in the approach about the movies of the time. Like it was almost trying to capture what it would be like viewing a movie at the time rather than the actual events of what's going on. You get these long driving scenes, a lot of radio, music playing, it's kind of just a lot about the style. And I think that was why he chose to do that, because he has a huge reverence for those kind of films in that era.
Right, a reverence that can be seen in his filmography, movies. His most recent two films being The Hateful Eight and Django Unchained, which are both, in certain senses, throwback westerns. And Tarantino really displays his appreciation for the classical Hollywood Western genre in this film. The main character, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, Rick Dalton, is a Hollywood cowboy star, TV star.
Yeah, and it's set in the 50s when that kind of action hero was especially popular. But now, he's 10 years outside of that, on the fading end of his career.
Yeah, so it's the classic fading star story.
And I mean, it makes sense because Tarantino, he's a very different person than he was in the 90s. He's an older man. He's looking back to this time. I mean, I see it as he's looking back to this time, a time of movies that he loved that he never lived in, trying to craft that.
So it's certainly a degree of self-indulgence present here, which I actually also saw an article recently that discussed the fact that the director actually made multiple episodes. Or no, he wrote multiple episodes of the cowboy drama that Rick Dalton, the character, it's a fictional cowboy drama that Rick Dalton, the character, starred in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and he said in an interview that he would like to actually produce these episodes. So he has a reverence for this kind of filmmaking that extends into the realm of him actually wanting to recreate it.
Yeah.
And he does to an extent in this film. There's recreated
there's a lot of scenes where they show clips of Jake Cahill, his character in the show, Leonardo DiCaprio's character in the show. And you can't help but laugh because they seem so authentic in the melodrama and the Western classic action that nowadays we would see as a little overdone, but at the time was on TV, something that everybody watched constantly.
Right. So I think that what really imbues it with the Tarantino sort of self-indulgence that he's kind of infamous for at this point are scenes like, there's one sequence that I'm thinking of in particular where DiCaprio's character is edited into a scene from The Great Escape, and
that was really weird.
And it's played for comedy because obviously everyone knows that DiCaprio wasn't in fact in that film. So it's self-aware, and yeah, I'm not going to continue on that thought anymore.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. It's a winking eye at the camera, and it's obvious, and that's why you're laughing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now that we got our initial impressions out, I think it's time to discuss what everybody is thinking about coming out of the theater.
Right.
Which is the ending.
The property of this movie that I think is going to put a lot of butts in the seats is the Manson murders.
Right. From the trailer, you could clearly see, you get the glimpse of, they say, what's her, I can't remember the actress name, but she says, Charlie's going to dig you, and they show a picture of Manson, or whoever plays him in the movie.
Right,
shot. And they say Sharon Tate's name multiple times, and anyone with even a passing knowledge of what happened is going to start feeling that tension throughout the whole movie.
Right.
Going into it, you're feeling that.
We see the CLO Drive sign. We see the shadowy figures with knives walking down the street. Mm-hmm. And then, as Cory just mentioned, we get not one but two shots of Charles Manson in the trailer. And hilariously, only one of them is actually in the movie.
Yeah, I thought that was funny.
Charles Manson is in this film for 10 seconds.
Right. It's not even a full glimpse of him, really. It's like a passing glimpse.
Right. He doesn't, or he might have a line of dialogue, but he's off screen for it. You don't actually see him speak. So that is to say, this is not a movie about the Manson murders, but as you just said, we're talking about, if we're going to dive straight into talking about the sort of elephant in the room, which is the film's ending, then we definitely have to talk about how the entire Manson aspect of the story plays into things.
Yeah, so, we're going to spoil it, so hopefully you've seen it, but whether or not it was expected, knowing Quentin Tarantino's usual ploy in this revisionist history type of situation, I think it was still somewhat shocking to everyone exactly what happened, and literally changing the exact opposite outcome of what happened in the ending of the film. Right.
You see Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character, who we have heretofore not mentioned, I think.
Yeah, for good reason.
Yeah, I mean, he's an amusing presence.
Right. And Brad Pitt, wonderful, but the character itself, it's static.
Right. You see his entire character, I think, in the trailers, and he's an entertaining presence, and I think actually his character possesses some of the more interesting slice of life moments that you get to see at Hollywood life in the late 1960s. Yeah. He's not a dynamic character, so but he does play an extremely important role in the climactic sequence of the film.
Right. So to reiterate, they see Rick Dalton, the murderers, the cult members, and come up to the idea, rather than their initial thought to go and kill the people that are in Sharon Tate's house, they decide to kill people in Rick's house instead. And what actually happens is Cliff kills all of them brutally. And
Leo one with his flame.
Leo torches one. So yes, very, very classic Tarantino violence.
Yeah, we get this brief, visceral, very extreme, classic Tarantino bloodbath scene that it really feels like has been saved for the end, and almost another kind of knowing eye wink to the camera on Tarantino's part that I got, because so much of this film is almost dead space. There's very little happening. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes long. There are these long driving sequences. There are relatively pointless character developments.
Oh, definitely.
Long drawn-out sequences that do not contain much of what you might consider a classical Tarantino fare. And he's done long scenes in the past, don't get me wrong, like the wonderful bar scene in Inglourious Basterds comes to mind, but there's still a degree of tension in that sequence.
And we can get into these specifics later, obviously, too, but for now, my thought on this is, when I was watching the movie, is that was the only real scene where I felt like, this is Quentin Tarantino doing this. And the rest, initially, as I was in the movie, I was thinking, this is completely different than any other Quentin Tarantino movie. It is that big of a tonal shift that it literally feels like a different director.
Yeah. And then at the end, it almost feels like he comes back and punches you in the back of the head and says, fuck you, I'm Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't give a shit what you think about my movie.
I mean, he knows how to rile people up. Like, that's his thing. So You did say, right, that you kind of felt like you expected it a little bit because that's at this point his go-to, right?
Right. We saw Hitler's face get mutilated by point blank SMG rounds in Inglourious Bastards.
I mean, a former slave, brutally murdering people in Django Unchained. Yeah, those are the two main like historical ones.
And this is similar to that in some ways, I think. And so I didn't expect Tarantino to depict the Manson murders as they actually happened, because he's never been interested with depicting history as it actually has happened. He's been interested in the past in warping history into monstrous variations that provoke a very, very unique response in the viewer.
Did you feel like this was a little anticlimactic at the ending?
So yeah, for me, I think because I expected that kind of reversal of expectations to occur to some degree, I was let down by the sequence. It's relatively short, and it comes out of absolutely nowhere. I mean, I don't know. You know that the murders are coming, but you sort of are still waiting for the dominoes to fall into place, and then sort of before the dominoes are even set up all the way, Brad Pitt just viciously murders all of the...
It's definitely surprising.
It's extremely surprising. So in that regard, it caught me off guard. But then as soon as you sort of realized for me, as soon as I realized what was happening, I wondered where the film was going to go after that. And I figured that there was still more to go, and then it ends minutes after this climactic bloody scene.
I agree, and I think what you said the other night about the kind of dread that you felt seeing these like characters that died in real life just like living out the ending was kind of was a bizarre feeling.
Right. Yeah, that actually was Margaret's point.
Oh, that was okay.
And so that was a point that was brought up about the final interaction that occurs between Rick Dalton and Sharon Tate and her friends who live in or who are staying with her at the time, which is, for anyone familiar with how this historical event actually played out, it is this very obvious dichotomy where you, on one hand, get to see a pregnant, overjoyed Sharon Tate finally welcoming in Rick Dalton to her home, perhaps launching off the second phase of Rick Dalton's storied career, and prepared to live out the rest of her happy life. On the other hand, you have this immense disconnect at the very end of the film, because you have these three real characters. You have Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Abigail Folger's boyfriend, I forget his name.
Yeah, Polish name.
Long Polish name. And they're all real historical figures, and you have them all meeting this cartoon character, Rick Dalton, who has just stepped into a momentous historical moment and completely, fundamentally altered it.
And completely by accident. He's a blind drunk, they even say in the narration. So it's bizarre. It disconnects you from reality in a kind of disturbing way. It's odd too, because I do get exactly what you're saying, and that's definitely kind of how I feel it now. But my initial take on it was actually a knowing completion of Rick Dalton's character arc, right? Because we get this long character building scene that we got for all the characters that ended up leading to nowhere, right? He's crying over his book because he sees a fading hero in it, which he feels like he is. He pushes himself to finish out the scene in the James Stacey show, The Lancer, and then that literally leads nowhere and goes directly into the ending. So it almost kind of formed that like classical arc at the end, right? With him finally being able to be a hero. And like you said, where that goes, it takes off his career, it, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter. It has the starting point, Al Pacino scene with him realizing that his career is dead, his career is over, ending with a heroic moment in his life.
And you could possibly view that as another Tarantino wink at the camera, because you have this very traditional heroic redemption at the end of the film where the main character is on an upward trajectory, and it results from what we know to have in real life been an absolutely horrific and senseless event, and one that Dalton intervenes in, like you said, completely accidentally, and almost it's sheer luck that lands him in the position he is at the end of the film. And I think that leads us nicely into this whole idea of chance that I think plays a really big role in the film.
Rick and Cliff, these characters, completely fictional, there was never a person in real life named Rick Dalton. Obviously, there was a lot of people like him, people that were famous for a few years, one show, and then ended up falling off the face of the earth. We of course get to see, like Isaac said, that slice of life of the Cliff Booth side, the stuntman who nobody knows, and he's basically living in poverty. So these seemingly unimportant, completely made up characters entirely change the course of history at a similar level as their entire existence, right? They have existed just to make a couple things together, make a couple movies together, end up falling off the face of the earth. Just like the event, they even said in the movie, the hippies come in, they go, Charles Manson told us to go to this guy's house and kill everybody in it. They don't even know who's in it. It's completely devised from somebody else's point. They, in real life, don't even complete it very carefully. They don't even try. They
Cleanly,
are sloppy. They, purposefully try to make it look all creepy and leave marks everywhere that makes it obvious to find them later. They're young. They don't know what they're doing. They're not murderers. They're just cult members. And
the murders are spur of the moment affairs that they plan to kill people, but they don't know who they're going to kill. They don't know how they're going to kill them. They don't know if they're going to have what it takes to kill them.
Right. One even left in the middle of the scene, just stole the car and drove away. So we get that depicted as well. We get the hippies are very senseless. They look like they're in a trip constantly. They're just kind of wandering around. One of the characters, just as soon as she gets picked up by Cliff Booth, just says like, "Hey, I'm going to suck your dick right now." And he, because she's too young, he of course refuses.
Yes, the noble Cliff.
Yeah, Booth. The noble Cliff Booth, who for some reason, who also killed his wife or something. Yeah.
Yes, it's one of the more bizarre wild card elements of the film.
In terms of the random chance element that's characterized here, I thought it was important to have that because it's very fitting of their characterization as well. Only Rick Dalton's character is the only one who gets that arc that we talked about, and it's only completed through an act of random chance. An act of random chance similar to the real life killing. It's like all of these pieces are not in some grand scheme like they are in a movie. They're just kind of falling into place. Nothing has actually led up to those events. It's completely random. Mm-hmm. The fact that Cliff Booth had seen those three who he kills in the end doesn't affect what happened. It could have just been random people and he still would have killed them. The events of the movie basically didn't really matter.
On the other hand, that last phrase you uttered, the events of the movie didn't really matter, that is the impression that I left the theater with. And my initial impression of the film was a bit lukewarm because it just left me feeling a little hollow inside. I didn't feel that I had come away with the same gut punch reaction that a lot of Tarantino films instill in you at the end. I felt more like I had been told to screw off by a director who either wasn't intent on conveying any specific idea, or the idea he was intending to convey was so nebulous and beguiling that it just didn't come across for me at all as someone who is very familiar with Tarantino's filmography and with historical events that the film was grounded in. Mm-hmm. I think I expected right off the bat to come away with I don't know what I expected to come away with, but I expected to come away with something. And instead, I almost felt like the ending killed the sense of
the momentum, whatever was building up.
Yes, the momentum, and also just the meaning or the whatever I was looking for.
The theme, right?
The theme, yeah, whatever I was hoping the ending would synthesize into a feeling that I got walking out of the theater. Instead, the ending numbed me a little bit.
Yeah,
I think
it did seem like there was some kind of theme in there about the strive to perfection, right? The one character who, the young girl in the film says, we strive to perfection and never get there, but it's the pursuit, right? So it seemed like there was that overarching theme, especially with Rick Dalton, but you're right, the ending completely throws that out the window.
Mm-hmm. So maybe Tarantino's not concerned with making a film that satisfies or that checks off all the boxes of what constitutes a perfect movie, and he's self-aware of that, and he is instead creating a film that intentionally subverts expectations and also perhaps dulls the impact of... I don't know. It's hard to say dulls the impact.
Okay, let's go to... So you said that was your impression leaving the film, the theater. What do you think about it now?
Well, I think I'm still thinking about it now, and I don't think that the film is as hollow as I had initially walked away with, because I've continued grasping for something in what I watched, and I didn't just walk out of the theater, feel hollow, and then forget about the movie. I walked into the theater feeling hollow, and then sort of searched myself and searched the film
Wow.
for things to grasp onto. And I don't know that I have come away with anything more concrete than I walked out of the theater with, but I certainly was compelled by the product that Tarantino and company created to look for meaning. And maybe Quentin would be laughing at me if he knew.
I don't think so. I think what's nice about watching a good movie is that there's multiple meanings you can get from it. I picked up on the pursuit of perfection idea. We're trying to tease out something that has to do with like finding meaning in a take on real life, right? In monotony. So there's multiple aspects you could view this. You could view this as an allegory for what's happening in history at the time, right? The Sharon Tate's kind of the picture of Hollywood optimism, and that we think is going to be killed by the Manson murders. But then, I mean, obviously that's another thing that was just thrown out the window by the ending. So.
Right, is that entire historical pivot point is thrown out the window, and it's not to say that the Manson murders were the one and only thing that ended the hippie era,
but it's
an oversimplification.
Yeah.
But symbolically, there's the insinuation that the era that Sharon Tate and Rick Dalton and the entire cast of characters that populates the film symbolize are going to continue on after the credits roll, rather than having that vibe be snuffed out by the horrific acts of Charles Manson. And I think that I'm not exactly sure how to read that. One interpretation that jumps out at me is that it's almost a regressive vision. We have this idea that the form of stardom and the Hollywood system that existed up to that point can sort of continue to flourish, and you can almost read it as this idealistic, optimistic ending where it's a what if scenario. You know, would the movies be better today if the Manson murders hadn't happened, to put it very simply?
Would they be better if the people that made the films and shows that he loved, those old time westerns, would it be better if we still respected those people as much as we do other actors like, I don't know, Leonardo DiCaprio or so? I don't know the comparison. Yeah,
if Rick Dalton and the people that Rick Dalton, the real life people that Rick Dalton symbolizes, if their careers continue for 20 more years, that maybe is Quentin Tarantino's wet dream. You know,
probably. Yeah.
And speaking of Quentin Tarantino's wet dream, I have to mention the foot fetish.
Not one,
aspect.
But two.
Yes,
very intense feet in the scene.
Right. You have Margot Robbie's actually both of her feet crossed,
right,
and taking up almost the entire frame in a movie theater scene.
Right.
It's not a short shot.
Hard to ignore.
Hard to ignore in the context of Tarantino's filmmaking history. And then there's another shot of the main hippie actress.
Yeah, we better know her name, because I also couldn't remember what it was.
Pussycat, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Who is
Margaret Qualley?
Yeah,
Margaret Qualley, the actress. So we have another up close shot of her feet on the dashboard of a car.
Yeah, on the windshield, actually. Like, it's even more,
hard to overlook.
Yeah.
But to go back to the bigger point at hand, the sort of regressive vision of this era, I think, extends to the depiction of the hippies themselves. The only representation of that culture that we receive are the ones that we've already discussed, the bumbling, idiot, stoned hippies who have no sense and are easily beaten up by a burly traditional Hollywood stuntman. There is no attention paid to the horrific brainwashing that Charles Manson subjected his followers to. Instead, they're almost depicted as dumb kids who made the choice to do what they did. And the film doesn't...
They came to that conclusion in the car, right? About what was her like grand realization about why they needed to kill Rick Dalton? It was
to make a statement about the corruption or just the indulgence of the star system, I think, and like the toxic celebrity. I mean, the idea.
It could be that is like the depiction of brainwashing in there, but it seems, like you said, the film portrays it as that's kind of their own ideology. Like they have a hippie ideology,
or it at least doesn't flesh out the background enough for us to conclude otherwise. Yeah,
which it could have probably in a over almost 3-hour movie.
Mm-hmm.
So
where there's a lot of dead space already. So you could argue that that's irresponsible.
I mean, I think general movie consensus, we could say there's some pacing issues, right? You mentioned empty space. There's scenes that we don't really lead anywhere, and while it often seems intentional, it's still baffling. It's still head scratching.
Yes.
You know, some of the inclusions and exclusions of the film.
Right. To clarify how bizarre the pacing of the film is, it takes place over the course of 2 days.
Right.
The first day takes up probably the first 2 hours of the film and is paced in such a way that you forget that you're watching the events that take place over the course of a single day. I know that there's one part where Sharon Tate goes to the movies, and then a lot of stuff happens, like 45 minutes of other events happen.
Right,
where you're following other
those
characters.
character building scenes that I talked about. We already talked about Rick Dalton in the shooting the TV pilot, but there was also Margot Robbie in the theater and Cliff Booth going to Spawn Ranch. Right, these 3 very character building scenes that ultimately don't lead to anywhere,
and they're all separate. And you are returned to each, like specifically returned to the Sharon Tate scene so long after you were introduced to it that it has this effect of being like, oh my god, yeah, right, like she's still in the movie theater, this is still happening simultaneously. It's the simulation almost of things happening in real time, this slow, drawn out,
that's
just day-to-day monotony that the film does a lot of work to emphasize.
And speaking of which, I thought, speaking of the slice of life, you know, monotony situation, I thought that the Sharon Tate aspect of that was probably the most compelling. I don't know if it was intentional, but I think it said some things about the portrayal of men and women in film, right? We see, even 10 years after, Rick Dalton, people still recognize him because he was a hero. He was the forefront of TV cowboy action hero for however many years. And Margot Robbie's character, Sharon Tate, is, you know, something that people clapped for in the movie, but kind of forget about in real life.
Right. Sharon Tate, I know in real life was not the most prominent of Hollywood stars.
But considered an up-and-coming newcomer.
Right.
Like a prominent up-and-comer.
But I think that regardless of how she was considered in real life, the viewing experience in the film is very much what you just described. If you don't know who Sharon Tate was, if you don't know who Rick Dalton was, Rick Dalton was no one. Rick Dalton was a fictional character. But if you have no background on the TV cowboy archetype, and you have no background on Sharon Tate, then you end up viewing this very clear separation between how the two genders are treated by the audiences, like you just described. But if you have the background, you know, the knowledge surrounding the real life players and the events that the film is depicting or stretching in fictional ways, you do get a different viewing experience to an extent, I think. And the best example of that is probably the climax that we already talked about. If you don't know what really went down on that night when Charles Manson sent his followers to Cielo Drive and they ended up murdering Sharon Tate and 3 others, in actually, or 4 others, 3 or 4 others.
I think in real life it was 4 others.
4 others, in just horrific ways, then you might not have, or you certainly will not have the same shocked reaction when the followers end up entering Rick Dalton's house instead. Yeah. You might think that that was just a part of the proceedings that went on in real life. And so it leads to very different viewing experiences where everyone knows, for instance, that Hitler was not killed by, you know, crusading like Nazi killer in Inglourious Bastards in real life. And so when Hitler's killed in Inglourious Bastards, there's a universal recognition from the audience that
everybody
what we're
jumps
watching
up and is like, what just happened? Yeah,
yeah. Not the same here. This is much more of it, almost, and Tarantino is aware of that fact, undoubtedly. And so there's this sort of toying with viewer reactions and perceptions of the film, and we were just talking about how many different meanings and ideas you can grasp for in any movie. And so I think that that hollowness that I was talking about earlier, that grasping for meaning, is something that it seems that was an intentional aspect of this film. It just goes in so many different directions and has so many different possible viewing experiences resulting from all the context surrounding it. There's just such a multitude of interpretations.
And I think that, you know, I think that makes sense because he's not trying to depict reality, right? That's the thing we said from the very beginning. He's trying to depict movies that he loved and not the time, because, you know, he's a movie lover. He doesn't care as much about the time. And I think that, you know, says something that he focuses entirely on these fictional characters. And the most that the real characters get in the film is about 1 line each, if even. We see Steve McQueen get 1 line. Bruce Lee, memorable scene, but really only 1 part.
And it's making fun of him.
Right. They're not meaningful at all. They're all passing. They're all asides.
Honestly, that's a very interesting point that brings up the fact that Tarantino almost throws history out the window. The most he does with it is make fun of it or twist it up into something that's almost unrecognizable from what actually occurred. and focus instead on the cinematic, artificial, manufactured aspects that he crafted to his own liking. And maybe that's a statement in and of itself.
Yeah, probably. There's some really great shots. I mean, cinematography is really good. We talked about at the beginning the kind of authentic atmosphere created through the first 2 hours of the film. Also very on point. Yeah, set designs, wonderful. The views of the Hollywood Hills and of driving through from the hills to LA.
Right.
The thing that I thought, I was like, it really does just take a long time to drive from one location to the other because the area is so big. So the fact that there was, in one scene, one driving sequence, multiple shots and multiple song changes kind of fit the reality of the authenticity of the situation.
It's a commute.
The commute. Yeah, exactly.
And it remains engaging, I think, because of how vividly the setting is depicted. You are content just watching things play out, even though they're not playing out as they did in real life, because it's just such a vividly realized artificial set. And that's always maybe been Tarantino's prerogative. Is
whether that disconnect between reality and fantasy bothers some people, which I'm sure it does, and is very controversial. The whole of the movie, I would imagine, is controversial, but to him that just makes sense because that's his normal approach, is focusing on the movie, the fantasy of it, and not the reality.
Right. And I think now hitting upon that buzzword of controversy, one really important aspect, I think, or at least one aspect of the film that's sure to draw a lot of discussion, is its use of Charles Manson and his followers means.
An interesting take, right? It was not as reverent as we thought it would be. We were expecting some serious serial killer glorification, and instead got almost none.
Barely a depiction of Charles Manson at all in the movie. The whole presence of Manson's family is ominous, and it definitely plays a role in the film, especially in Cliff Booth's independent storyline. The
Spawn Ranch scene, right? There's no music. It's just kind of created through they're all just kind of staring at him, ready for something to happen, and he knows something's going on, but isn't totally, he's still trying to figure it out.
Right, and most of the tension, I think, for viewers during this scene, or these scenes, comes from the historical context that people know surrounds the whole situation. They know what the family ends up doing in real life, and so it's tense watching.
Right. There's without that knowledge, you would be like, what's going on? But because of our historical background on it, we understand that, something could happen at any moment because they're all psychos. They're all crazy people. So
yeah, and I think that gets us back to this whole, the winking eye, Tarantino's winking eye, right? He lets that historical set dressing really seep in and get to you, and he makes you wait for it. And then the payoff is him just crinkling it up and throwing it out the window, and sort of he just twists the history up until it's unrecognizable and irrelevant to actual history. So I don't know if it's a responsible depiction of a serial killer or not, but certainly novel, and at least not as straightforward and reverent as I think some of the recent serial killer depictions, Ted Bundy being the most obvious example with a couple of Netflix series in the film.
Yeah, they kind of not really depicting him as the true-to-life, weird situation, right?
I think a lot of what's controversial about depictions like that are that they result in people kind of flocking around these figures and holding them up as maybe not condoning their actions, but at least celebrating or congratulating parts of their personalities and glossing over the absolutely horrific things that they did, or almost excusing the brutality with which they raped and murdered.
Right. There was almost no in the films, in the pieces that I've seen of even the documentary, there's not a lot about the brutality of it. It's more about trying to find his character.
Right. It's about the person. Right?
Yeah, bringing out I don't want to say sympathy, because I don't think anyone's trying to be we need to sympathize with. And I mean, maybe I don't know what the general take on that is, but rather than focusing on what actually happens in these, if you read a non-biased account, it's very difficult. It's brutal and horrific and shockingly, shockingly vile. Yes. So yeah, I don't know what that means at all, but
I think to contrast that with what we see in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, zero attention paid to the characters. They're one-dimensional caricatures. And the brutality is on full display, although interestingly a lot of it is carried out by one of the quote-unquote protagonist characters who, as we mentioned earlier, also gets this brief drop about how he murdered his wife in the past, and that's never really goes anywhere.
Was that supposed to be like he actually did murder his wife?
I think so.
It seemed like it.
I have not thought enough about that or researched enough about
Either
that
way, as nice as it is to see Brad Pitt in a movie, he's always entertaining. He's probably the least interesting of the three main characters. So, at least compelling anyway, I would say.
He's certainly an entertaining presence. I don't think I ever wished he wasn't in the movie.
Right.
But he never goes anywhere. He's more or less a plot device.
In terms of like a compelling story, right? We're not seeing an arc of him. He's kind of just he's the best friend staple next to Rick Dalton.
Right. To wrap up a little bit, I think, if you had to summarize your impressions of this film, maybe contextualize it in terms of Tarantino's filmography, how would you do so?
It certainly is not one of my favorites, but coming from a director that I really like, I would say I still thought it was really good. I don't know if I would rank it insanely high compared to the movies that I love, like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, but to me, it still speaks to me commenting on that like strive to perfection. Like there was an effort to make the appearance that he was like making an epic masterpiece kind of. And that's the ultimate impression that I'm getting from this. It's a man reflecting on something that he really loved, trying to make a passion project out of it, and using both elements that tie directly to his typical style and elements that are typical of a older, wiser director.
More mature filmmaker.
A more mature. There we go. That's the exact wording that I was trying to think of.
Yeah. And I think I come at it from a fairly similar background, having been a longtime fan of Tarantino's. He was one of the first auteur directors that who I really latched onto. I was surprised to not initially walk out of the theater having rave reviews to spout about this movie. I have had my perception of Tarantino complicated a bit in the recent past by readings I've done about his utilization of violence and arguments that his employment of violence, which is so central to his style, really numbs the viewing experience of his films. And there's also a lot recently too about the misogyny aspect, right? Because I've read two things now, people commenting on like why we shouldn't be watching Tarantino movies and why he's hates women and stuff like that. Uma Thurman has some quite damning things to say about her treatment on the set of Kill Bill. Tarantino does not have a stellar record as far as his comments on issues surrounding race goes, and obviously his relentless use of the N-word in all of his screenplays, except this one. I don't know if we can call that progress or not, but I think one thing that I can point to as some form of progression is his withholding of those classic trappings of Tarantino style. The hyper-violence is mostly what I'm thinking of here. And I was genuinely surprised to see him so restrained on that front. Yeah. And, I don't know if I was personally refreshed by it, but it's certainly something new. And I think that...
It is new.
Right, yeah. Like, seeing him consciously hold back on that is perhaps the mark of a more mature filmmaker than we've seen acting in the past. Yeah. And I don't think more mature means better, but this is not the same man that made Reservoir Dogs. Definitely and that's, not. I think, really what I come away with more than anything out of this whole viewing experience is how far Tarantino has come.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't know, he's a problematic figure, so I don't know what his place is in pop culture or society and what his rightful place is, but he's here, and it's pretty interesting to note his evolution.
Yeah, I was trying to write something earlier about it, and the main thing that came to me at the time was the change aspect of it, right? He has a conscious, seems like there's a conscious effort to make something different, to make something unique to himself. And he also, part of that like winking eye thing that you were talking about, I think he knows that change is going to be difficult for fans and non-fans alike, right? Some people are going to have a difficult time seeing something from a director they know that is different. And the fact that he was so okay with that he just took hold of that and like made a whole movie out of that like different aspects of that he wanted to convey, I think that spoke to me the most, right? The conscious effort not to tread water, not to repeat and make a crowd-pleasing film, because he knows he's almost done, right? He said he's going to make one more, and then he's done. Supposedly, right? But I think that fits in the storyline of his career, right? It fits with he's about to be done, so he's spending the last bits making passion projects.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps looking back on this film with some perspective years down the line, we'll be able to glean some more concrete takeaway from it.
I'm most interested to hear the perspective of somebody who grew up at that time. Right, like I know, definitely. Sort of like my dad, he was born in 1957, and he grew up during, like, he knew everything that would have happened at the time. So I'm interested to see people that age perspective, knowing the events firsthand and seeing the movies and seeing the real life of what happened. And I haven't read anything yet of people's perspective.
I haven't either. For now, I'm content with the multitude of reactions that this film is bound to evoke in viewers of all different backgrounds, with all different levels of background knowledge surrounding the material, with all different levels of past experience with Quentin Tarantino. And I think that this is a provocative film, and that's better than being a hollow one, which is what I initially thought it was. But after reflecting further upon it and having my thoughts bounce around in my brain to the extent that they have over the past few days, I am happy to have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood join the ranks of other Quentin Tarantino films that will bounce around in my head well into the future. Thanks for bearing with us on this journey, Once Upon a Time in Seattle, Washington.
Isaac's bedroom.
We'll be back to tackle another film soon.
We haven't decided.
We haven't quite decided yet. I would love to do The Farewell.
I just saw it, actually.
Oh, you did?
Saw it. Really
well,
good.
maybe we could. I could still.
I would actually like to see it again. I'd actually like to see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood again.
I would too. And
let's do a second podcast about it.
Honestly, probably could fill up a second podcast worth of material. There's a lot that we didn't talk about.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's a lot we didn't even think of. And that is why I came away from the movie overall with a positive impression.
Yeah.
But okay.
Goodbye.
20% off your next deal with Squarespace 20.
Thanks, Archie.